Hello YouTube. I was looking at my videos and realized that I had a Sig done way early in the series that was just a no voiceover, quick takedown and put back together without any explanation. And wanted to address that with a little bit more robust video that actually explained, all the ins and outs of how to do it right. So today we are going to grab the 228. This is it's very similar to the 220. This is just a 9mm double stack. The 228 versus 229 goes into some of just the changes in frame and whether or not the slide is cut as a one piece. But functionally, all these Sig series of the 22 something are essentially the same. The 250 is a different design altogether, but the 220, the 228, the 229, and the 226 are all essentially the same mechanism. And that's what we're going to look at today. So, no magazine, we're empty. Take the gun down, lock it back, slide the slide release down, and that'll just let us take the slide off the frame. Put the frame aside for now. This is a non-captivated spring, so hang on to it. When you pull the guide rod out, it will launch otherwise. The way Sig does these springs, there's a short coil on one side, so you want to make sure that's at the back of the guide rod. The other side is wider and moves freely. You don't want it on backwards, or the short coil will bind when it tries to function. It's designed so that it actually holds on to the guide rod. Standard barrel up and out. Now, again, depending on which model you have, you may have one where the slide is all one piece of metal, and you may have this variation where there's a set of roll pins that hold in a steel block which has the breech face and the extractor and firing pin safety all built into it, which just essentially is held in by that one pin into the frame. Or it may just be milled out of one piece of steel, and that whole section would actually not come out in some of them. And I forget which model is which in terms of that. Anyway, we've got this roll pin here. This is a double roll pin. That's a small roll pin inside of a larger roll pin. You can essentially treat it as one roll pin when you're knocking it out. Some people like to knock out the middle one and then knock out the other one. Really doesn't have to happen that way. There are other ones though where this is a solid pin, and also where it's a tapered pin where one end is larger than the other. Pay attention to the size of the holes. If one side has a larger hole than the other, well, that's the exit direction. You don't ever want to push that large size out through the small side. In this particular one, it doesn't matter. It's just the roll pins. And I gotta adjust this light. Squeaky, squeaky. And move this over so I don't hammer my light. So, knock out Mr. Roll Pin, and you can maybe see a little better there, the one inside the other. They'll always be rolled in opposite directions, so if the seam of the larger one is on the right, then the seam of the smaller one should be on the left. Now, this is also probably retaining the firing pin, so keep a finger there when you pull that slide out. The whole thing's going to bounce around a little bit. But essentially, that's all that was holding this block into the slide itself. So this is on, this does back up right against the slide. So that's, the breech face is, that round when it goes off, it's still pushing against the whole slide there. They just made this piece removable, and it just lifts literally straight out. And we want to pay attention to this spring, which I just dropped. But essentially, that's the firing pin safety, and that's the only thing holding the firing pin in right now. So when something pushes the firing pin safety up, then the firing pin itself can launch right out. When that's not under tension, it comes right out the side, and then we can see the firing pin and firing pin spring come out. Again, this is got a small coil on one end that actually slips over a slight ridge there and snaps on firmly, and the wide end is the far end. Don't put it on this way where it's nice and easy, otherwise it'll bind on the front side. And when you take this on and off, remember to just gently turn it in the opposite direction of the coil wind to spread that coil just a little bit as you push it over stuff. It will make your spring last longer. You'll see several different grooves in the firing pin. This one is just where the roll pin goes through, and so the roll pin is also capturing the firing pin. And then this ledge is the safety. So if I dump out the spring, essentially what's happening here is that the safety, when nothing is pushing it into the up position, is here, which means it's going to bounce into the safety right at that ledge, and that's not far enough forward for the firing pin to actually clear the breech face. If something lifts the safety up, though, now it can come all the way to the back. So normally it can only go so far, but with the safety disengaged, it can go back further, which is just enough room for it to pop out the front. I don't remember if this one is the inertial one or not. Yeah, this is what they call an inertial firing pin, which means that if the firing pin is completely pressed flush, flush with the back, in other words, if something were to lay on that and push the firing pin as far forward as it can go, it's not enough to get it to protrude out and strike a primer. So that means when the hammer hits this, it has to hit it hard enough so that when the hammer bottoms out, it's imparted enough momentum to continue compressing that spring just enough to get it that last few millimeters with enough force to strike the primer still. There's nothing else to the slide. Dovetail cuts for the sights, rail system. This curve cutout is just for where the takedown lever is. That's where the slide stop operates, and this cut here we'll see eventually is the where the disconnector rides, and that's it. Nice, straightforward. The only other piece on here is the ejector, and the ejector is pressed in from the back. Don't try and lever it out from the front. It's going to have some play and flex, but that's not where you actually take it apart. If you need to get it out, you got to get something thin and drive this piece out. So if it's not all the way to the back, maybe you can get something under it to start prying it. If not, you can always start it this way as well. I'm going to do that over this little ledge here. I'm just going to use my... So I just tapped this little ledge to get it started a little bit. Now I can stick my little screwdriver under it and just work it back and forth until the whole thing is going to come free. And that's it. It's got it should have a bend in it that's going to control if how tight it holds onto the round. That bend might be a little different in yours depending on it, if it's been adjusted or not. Some of them don't have much of a bend, and then the rounds don't hold correctly, but that's always an adjustable piece in most firearms. So that's it. You can also pop it out to replace it. So putting it back in is pretty straightforward as well. You just push it in there as far as you can get it, and then come in, use a punch to push it the rest of the way, and that's pretty much all the way in. You can always come and just give it one little gratis tap, and it's not going to go anywhere. So we'll go ahead and reassemble while we're here. And when you're putting it together, all those flat surfaces pretty much point up. So if you're getting confused as to which is the top, which is the bottom, when you put the firing pin safety in, if you put it in the down position, it's going to retain the firing pin for you temporarily. If that slips, the pin will go flying across the room. So we're going to try and keep a finger near there for just a little bit. But really, all we have to do here is get it lined up and pushed up to the top. And now we can hold it in place and line up this hole to put that pin back through. So let's see, which way do I want to do that? I think I can get it started here. We're going to get the pin started. Now I don't want to send it too far through because I could see that that firing pin has come out just a little bit further than it normally sits, which means that it normally does rest against that roll pin. So before we go driving that roll pin in, we want to make sure that we're pushing the firing pin as far in as we can reach. So I'm just going to have my finger back here doing that so that when I hammer this, I'm not going to run into the side of the firing pin. And so once I get it a good ways in, now I don't have to worry about it. And you can see the firing pin is much further in now. That's its normal rest position. And then I can switch back to the roll pin punch and drive that roll pin in properly without mangling it. And since it is a double roll pin, I overdrive it just a little bit and then level it out from the other side so that it doesn't intrude into the finger guards on either side, or the grip ridges, whatever you want to call them. So that's the slide. We'll keep the barrel out for now to show the locking mechanism a little bit later as we get into the frames. I'm just going to put those guys aside, as well as this giant piece of spring wire. And put those up there. Okay, so the frame. I really like these in general. I think this is a neat design. It's some things that I don't like. I mean, it's an aluminum frame, but it's got a big steel block for all the parts that matter. So you really don't have issues with frame wear and tear on them because there's not a whole lot going on. You know, the rails are really the only place where aluminum is rubbing up against steel. Everything else that's actually involves any amount of force is all steel on steel. So the lock system is pretty straightforward. As the gun fires and moves backwards, this little ledge here cams underneath, right underneath the locking block. And likewise on the way back, as it's pushed here, it's going to ride up this surface right there, and that's where that wear mark comes from. And so that's the whole unlock and lock motion. And then you've got this big jump here from the magazine up. That way you don't have any chance. This distance, when you're looking at it and you're trying to figure out if you're getting rounds that are stubbing here, it means that there's something wrong in the distance that the round has to jump. And that means as it's knocked out of the magazine, this is kind of, you know, the beginning of the feed ramp, and then this is the real feed ramp. If there's vertical clearance between these two, you want to make sure that the horizontal clearance is always about at least always twice as far horizontally as vertically that it would have to go. So here you've got 4 millimeters and then less than a 1 millimeter gap vertically. That's plenty. It's that the problem comes when you're going not very far forward but very high. That gives you a chance to actually stub around on this edge. But as long as this edge, every time there's a change in height, goes back about twice as far as it went up, your rounds are never going to get stuck there. So design wise, it's all solid. We're going to take the side panels off. And you're going to be able to see some of the interesting spring decisions that were made in this gun, because they're kind of neat. So first thing that you can see is this little spring. It's about as thick as a paper clip, and this is what operates the the hammer drop mechanism. And since we haven't really identified the parts on the inside, it's not going to be obvious what it's doing at this point. We will get into why that functions, but essentially it's going to come up and lift the sear out of the way, while at the same time being in a position that the hammer is, when the hammer drops, it's dropping onto this piece. So basically right here, you're just pushing against this little coily spring tension, but as soon as you run into the sear and push the sear off the hammer, suddenly you're going to feel the full weight of the hammer right on your thumb here. So that little pop was all it took. Now I've moved the sear off, and now I'm literally holding the hammer with this piece. So again, when you run into the sear, you'll feel, you take the sear pressure off and you'll catch the hammer with your thumb here. And then as you release here, you see that you are in fact really, that's your thumb moving the hammer. And on the other side, there's another spring on the outside, so to speak. Oops, I'll lose all our screws at once. And so, I'm just going to get these grip panels, put them off to the side. And here you have I don't think, is that, yeah, this is both your trigger return spring and the trigger bar spring. So when the disconnect happens and that gets pushed down, then it's this curved spring that's pushing the trigger bar back up, and it's also what's pushing the whole thing towards the back. So this curved spring has got those two functions. One, it wants to push the trigger bar back, and it wants to push it up. As that spring gets squished, it wants to push up and back. And what's kind of interesting is that rather than trying to tuck it on the inside between all the other moving parts, they laid it on the outside and just put space for it built right into the grip. So that's where that spring actually sits. And that way it doesn't rub on anything. It's got plenty of room to move, and you don't have to worry about it being pinched in between two metal pieces that are trying to move. So kind of clever. This is also an ambidextrous magazine release design. So this little plate and the shape of the area it's in, that same area exists over here. So you can actually take that whole system out and put it in the other direction, and you're good. Now, what they've done differently model to model is how the hammer spring is retained. This is my personal favorite. This is really easy to get on and off because basically they built a ramp. This little rampy surface here makes it really easy to slide that whole mechanism up, and then it clicks right over and holds onto it. And so we'll get into there in a second. But first, because these parts are... Actually, no, we could do that first in theory. Yeah, let's give that a try. Let's try and take our hammer spring pressure off. So, let's see. Can't push on the hammer strut, obviously. We want to push on the actual piece of metal. And pop it up and then over that ledge. And so now the whole thing can come out, and you can get a better view of how that works. It's this thin part is just what can fit in the middle here, and then these wider shoulders just slide. So when you're putting it together, you're going to just be sliding it up until the shoulders pop right over those ledges, and then they're going to snap into place. So when putting it together, you just got to feel your way in on the back till it's in the right spot, and then right here, you just lift, and again, use a screwdriver to pop it that last little bit in, and you're back on. So that's pretty darn easy when it comes to hammer springs under great tension. Now the other thing is they've got this retaining pin, so unless you're replacing this spring, there's no reason to take this apart. If you're putting in a new hammer spring, then yeah, you've got to compress this, get the pin out, and take it apart. But otherwise, you just treat it as an assembly. There's nothing in here that's going to get dirty or require a ton of cleaning. It's just the mainspring. All right. So the first one we're going to take off here is this mechanism, and it's actually fairly clever and brilliant, all in simple ways. This spring, not only is it the tension spring that's making that flop back up, basically as we push it down, we're winding this coil, so naturally the coil wants to unwind, but it's got a self-retaining mechanism. So this is one piece of metal on the outside that you touch with your thumb, and it's got a right angle shelf that goes in there to monkey with the sear. But then this shaft that it's on is actually a square piece on the inside, and I'm going to stick my finger on it to hang on to it as we remove the spring, and you're going to see how that works. So this spring, to remove it, you just pop it straight up. It's got a right angle curve right here that lets it go into that hole. You're going to see how it just turns at a 90-degree there and would pop into the hole. But once we've released the pressure, what you'll see is, notice how it's got this zigzag through this slot, and under tension, what you'll see is that the top and bottom of the zigzag actually bite into the top. There's actually cuts in the side of them. So if that was just a vertical cut into this, then it would stop, you know, here when it hit the inside and the outside of that cut. But it's actually got another set of cuts that we're about to look at. But what that means is that when it's under any tension at all, you can't lift it off the gun. It's still holding the whole gun up by the spring. So obviously that's not good for the spring. So to get the spring off, you do want to put it backwards just enough to get to that middle position, at which point then you will be able to lift it right up and off of that. At that point, this can also come straight up and off. And now the only thing holding that thing up is my pinky finger shoved down the inside of the gun. So I'm going to drop that and pull the piece out so we can take a look at it. So here was what I was talking about on the side view. Like I said, this isn't just a straight cut down into that cylinder. As well as a straight cut, they've made a side cut, and a side cut over here. And that's the whole mechanism that lets this one spring essentially become its own its own locking mechanism. When this spring sits in here and starts to be rotated, those ends on the top and bottom slide into those locking grooves, and once they're there, the spring can't come off of that metal. So this spring holds that piece of metal from falling into the inside of the gun, and it's also pinching this piece to the outside of the gun. So this spring is not only holding these two pieces of metal together, it's also, you know, as well as holding them together as a locking mechanism, it's holding the pieces to the gun, and it's basically providing its own tension to get it to position itself in the right place. So nice little intimate design of those pieces, all kind of keeping each other in line. So the next spring over here is this guy. Now it's just hooked under the trigger bar back here. Now there's a lot of places where it looks like you can hook this, so don't get confused. It hooks under the bottom of the trigger bar. When I take this out and off, you'll see it's just a little U-shaped hook. On the other end, it's a little 90-degree angle turn. Actually, it's two 90-degree angles, one to the inside, one to the outside. So that part goes into the little hole right behind the magazine release. And then when you're attaching it, it's not up here, it's not this big hole here. It'll fit in all these places and almost work. The only place it will actually work is right down there. Excuse me. The other thing is that on each of these models, like the 220 is a single stack, so it's a narrower. It's a 45, but it's a single stack, but the frame is narrower. And the 226 is yet a different dimension. Same design, but all with slightly different widths. And what you're going to find is that because they want this spring to lay essentially as flat as possible against each piece of metal that it needs to adjust, it basically has one layer here, and then it does a step down to another layer, and then a step down to the actual hook. So if we take this off and look at it from the side, we can see there's one height, two height, and then this big curve down to the hook. And that matches, you know, the depth of the metal that it leans against, so that it really is, you know, as close to the inside of the gun as possible to stay away from the outside of your grip panel. And it really does ride nice and smoothly along there and doesn't interfere with anything. But if you put an extra bend in this, all bets are off. So don't put this under any crazy tension other than it needs, and it shouldn't ever deform on you. Let's see, what else do we want to do before we take it all apart? We'll get into function once we can see it all a little bit better. Since I've taken all those springs out, it's hard to tell exactly which pieces are moving what from here. There are some important things. So basically, we'll go ahead and try and do some. This pin, which is the hammer pin, it's not supposed to be centered in the gun. It's supposed to stick out on this right side farther, because it is actually what guides the height of the trigger bar. Remember, the spring is pushing the trigger bar back and up. So in order for the trigger bar to be doing something to the hammer and then release at some point, like the whole double action pull, something needs to be pushing the trigger down gradually. And that's what this ramped surface on the back of the trigger bar is. The farther we pull, the trigger, that this pin can't go up or down, so that means that as we pull the trigger forward, the trigger is also being pushed down. And so basically the back of the trigger bar is grabbing the hammer, and what makes it let go of the hammer is it simply gets too far south, and now the hammer has clearance to go over it. Now at the same time, this leg is operating the firing pin safety, and you see that lift up. It's also pulling the sear out of the way. We'll get into all that once the parts are out of the way. But the important part is that this ledge is important, and if you somehow miss this and try and put it together with that pin flush, that ain't going to work, because it's never going to get pushed down. The trigger bar is never going to release the hammer. It's just going to be a mess. I mean, when you put your grip on, it would partially fix that problem, but I've seen people basically get it like this, get the trigger bar, you know, up there in the wrong position, and just cause themselves, you know, no end of pain and suffering when they put it together at this point and wedge all their parts in there. So point is to remember that does stick out, and it's not supposed to be flush. So the sear and sear spring, we can't really see how those guys work quite yet, so we're just gonna start knocking it down from the front. So the takedown lever itself, there is a retaining spring that provides some tension so that it does snap into the horizontal and then snap into the vertical positions. And in order to get that piece out, you have to work against that spring. So right now that spring is in a cutout in this pin, but when it's in like a 45-degree angle anywhere but straight up or straight back, basically that means that it's pushing that retaining pin spring out of the way, which means we'll be able to work it out of the gun at that point. So these are the grooves that I was just talking about. One groove there, one groove there, and a spring that we can't quite see yet that engages them. But as we rotated that, these other surfaces that don't have grooves were in contact with that spring and push it out of the way. Same thing for getting it past this next stage. Is once you get it in here, if you just rotate it, you'll hit a part which will push the spring out of the way, and you'll feel that, and you can just keep twisting it all the way off. And so that spring, now that we can see it from the side, this spring here that just intrudes on the hole a little bit is what's providing all that tension. And so when it's all the way in there and in the locked position, that spring is pushing into this groove, and so that's what gives it that snap to the horizontal, and then this groove with the pin on the bottom gives it the snap to the vertical. In any other position, that spring is basically pushed out of the window, which means you can slide the whole thing out. Now, Something to pay attention to is this. This one has a flat across it that looks like it's for a screwdriver. Some other ones have serrations, so it'll look more like the magazine safety does, or the magazine release does here. A whole bunch of little lines. It's important to remember that they're horizontal, and there's another piece which isn't obvious from the outside, but you have to remember which way is up on this pin. If this pin is in upside down, then you'll not be able to get it back together. And so we know it's incorrectly now because the gun was assembled. And from that assembled position, the locking block will be able to lift straight up and out. He said, will be able to lift straight up and out. Come on. Basically, it is fighting this pin just a little bit. Let me get everything in its forward position. That helps. Yeah. So I put the trigger back to the forward position. That helps rotate that piece to the right angle. All right. So now our locking block comes out, and you can see this spring that was lying in the side. Now this has two different functions. One is right there where it intrudes into that hole. That's that whole mechanism we were just talking about, where we push the spring out of the way, we get it all the way in there, and then it provides the snapping action by virtue of poking its way into those little grooves. And now the other thing it's doing is this leg of it here, and once we get that off of the pin, we'll show you that. Now that the locking block is out, this pin will just push out. Even though it looks like it's got a screwdriver hole, it's not. And what I'm going to do when I pull it out is I'm going to hold this orientation the same way it was in the gun. And the important part is to remember there's two grooves cut in the back of this pin, and they are actually cut in the bottom front side of the pin. So this is the pin facing the left side of the gun. If we just look at it straight underneath, they're not, those cuts aren't directly on the bottom, but they're not on the top at all. They are on the bottom and towards the front of the gun. That matters because of how it interacts with this piece. This is actually a lock for this piece. So this little cutout here is not wide enough for the whole pin. It's only wide enough for the pin in the exact right orientation. So those grooves on the side, whether it's one or a whole bunch, will always be horizontal, but it's important to make sure that the cuts are towards the front. If you get it wrong and you put it in upside down where the cuts are on the back, it will unfortunately still go in, but now this locking block will be in the wrong place in the gun and it won't settle all the way in. So you'll look at it from the side saying, hey, it's horizontal, it must be right. No, it's not. Those grooves got to be on the underside of the pin and towards the front of the gun. And then when it locks in, now it'll be in the right position. Flipping that to the other side only moves it a couple millimeters, but it's enough so that nothing lines up. And now we can also pull out the other piece, which is our slide lock lever. And if I have enough fingers to put everything back together, what's going on here? I hope I was not holding that off camera that whole time. This same spring that was, creating tension on that takedown lever, when the takedown lever is in place, it's actually pushing this spring down. And when that spring pushes down, that pushes this down. And that means that this lever is being held down normally, and some force, like the magazine itself on the last round, lifting it up, is what has to happen for it to lock back. And once there's nothing pushing on that, this little spring will make it return back into the unlocked position. So when you thumb it down, it wants to stay down because of this spring, and then this little leg here interacts with the magazine on the last round and gets lifted up. So, and then also in the locking block, the reason it's got this big hole cut out in the bottom half is to make room for this piece of metal and that spring. The other side, no cutout. So this cutout is the exact depth of this piece and the exact width of our spring. So that's how that chunk works. Now our trigger is trigger and trigger bar are essentially just flopping around, and we can generally just finagle them out of the gun with a little love and care. You got to kind of pay attention to where they ride, so you don't try and bring it out at a point where it really doesn't want to come out. Like I'm getting caught under that ledge there, which means I need to get it to move towards the inside a little bit. Let's see, can I do it just getting it all the way forward? It's been a while since I had to take this out. How much of that's going to get in the way? Really? This should not be this difficult. Bear with me. So the last one I was in was a 220, where this one can come out earlier. I think on this one, on the 228, 229, because of how they made the wider body. Oh no, there we go. We just had to get it up high enough that you could actually angle it. Once we can angle it, then we're good. All right, so putting that in where it was. As we come up, we're going to get to a point where we'll be able to tip it, and that's what makes all the difference, is you can tip it to the left side. And once you've tipped it, now you can get it all the way out of the gun. And this piece does come off, so the trigger bar itself separates from the trigger and just goes through the smaller hole. Parts of the trigger bar that matter, obviously this is going to be the disconnector, so the slide is going to push down on this when it does the disconnect stroke. This piece here, the top part of this is probably, if I recall, the single action Sear activator, and then this side ledge on the back is the double action piece that grabs the actual hammer to do the double action cocking. And if you recall from the original one, it's this cut right here that hooks the spring. Now, need to take a sip of drink. Excuse me. Tasty beverage. So the Sear spring is pretty straightforward. It's got a roll pin driven through right through the middle of the rail, but it's kind of blind. You can't drive it out the other side. And you really don't want to drive it in at all. You don't want to move that pin at all. It's a roll pin in aluminum. If you don't have to take it out, don't. All you have to do is unhook the spring. So we're just going to get in here under that leg of the spring and pop the spring towards the inside and let it just flop itself right off. And when we go to put it back together, we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to take something that'll hang on to it, push it down, and pop it under that same pin. But what we've done now is to release the pressure, which means all our guts should be able to come out now if we drop this pin. So this is the Sear pin, and in this case it's not captivated on either side. It's not peened in. It's just held in by tension from that spring, and it's kept centered by the fact that the slide is going to be on either side of it, so it really can't drift very far. So there's no left or right side to that Sear pin. It just comes out. The Sear spring comes out. The Sear and the firing pin safety come out. And right now, those parts are going to stay in for a second while we talk about these ones. So we're going to put it partially back together and talk a little bit about the Seer function. So when this spring is under tension, the Seer wants to be pushed down and back. Okay, so the Seer sits in the gun like this. This spring is pushing this part of the Seer around the pin. So this wants to come in from the bottom and hook under something. And that's going to be the hammer that it hooks under. Now, this piece is it's got a couple different functions. It's the firing pin safety. So this they call the elephant trunk that sticks up. That's what pushes up on the firing pin safety button in the slide. And then there's some play. So this leg of the spring is actually what the trigger bar hooks onto. So it hooks onto the firing pin safety. But what we see on the firing pin safety is it's got two little legs. It's got the one leg that's bent up that the trigger bar is going to pull forward, but it's also got this back leg which hooks onto the Seer itself. So as we engage this, first we'll be moving this forward, which is going to move. Well, the Seer isn't going to move at all, but the elephant trunk is going to move up until engagement and undo the safety. But then it's going to bottom out here, which means if we keep pulling the trigger, we will pull the Seer forward and off of the hammer. Now this is where, seriously, I'm off camera. Son of a bitch. That was extremely frustrating. I apologize. I hope the whole video hasn't been doing that. I really need better cameras so I can see everything that I'm actually supposed to be showing you at the same time. Alright, I'm going to try and describe this again. Hopefully not too much starting over. The firing pin safety and the Seer. So the firing pin safety has two legs, one that comes out sideways and one that goes straight down. The trigger bar, that little tiny leg on the top of the trigger bar here, is going to hook under this first leg and pull it forward as we pull the trigger. So as we pull this forward, the first thing that's going to happen is the elephant trunk goes up, which pushes in on the firing pin safety in the slide, and then it's going to come forward enough for the back leg to pick up the Seer itself. So as we continue to pull the trigger, we're hooked onto the Seer, and both of them will move at once, and the Seer will come out of engagement with the hammer, and the gun will fire. So this is the single action mode, and we have to see the hammer itself to get to the double action mode. So we knock that hammer pin out, and our hammer. Now, don't just yank the hammer straight out the back. The hammer has this pin going through the rear of it, and there is a hammer bounce mechanism back here. This little plastic piece has a spring in it. If we can get a good view in there and see that spring system, the hammer actually, that silver pin in the hammer, whoops, I just knocked the extractor out, we'll get to that in a second, that hooks under that spring. So I can't actually pull this out the back of the gun. I'm pulling against that spring. Now that spring's purpose in life is to keep the hammer from resting on the firing pin. So even when the hammer strut is all the way pushing the hammer forward, it bottoms out before it actually lays flat against the firing pin. And the whole idea is that you don't want a situation where the hammer can rest on the firing pin, because then if you drop the gun and it hits the hammer, you have a chance of setting it off. So there's that spring which is going to grab the hammer and always want to pull it back a little bit. So if you naturally let the hammer strut all the way forward, it's not going to bring the hammer far enough forward to lean on the firing pin, and there'll be some wiggle room between how far the strut bottoms out and the actual firing pin, and then that spring always pulls it to the back of that wiggle room. The whole point is, don't try and yank it out the back, let it come forward a little bit so that you get out from under that spring. And what was holding the ejector in was simply the side of the hammer. It goes over basically the hammer pin and, the sear pin rather. The sear pin and the sear spring pin both go through this, but it's actually the body of the hammer that was holding it the rest of the way in place. So I think in theory we can do it all at once. Just toss the hammer in, and what we could do is actually hook our extractor over that leg and then lower it down in there. So that's how it sits. So you can take that apart technically before you take the hammer out. I just let it fall out. And again, I don't drive that pin out. There's no reason to. If we look carefully, we could see there is actually room. If you drove it all the way to the inside, it should... there's more space between where it is now and this side than there actually is metal here. So theoretically, you could drive it all the way out and it would fall in. Alternatively, you could take something flat and push it towards the outside. But again, you're wallering out a hole in aluminum, so don't do it if it ain't broken. There's no reason to. Now let's take a look at the hammer and sear engagement. This time I'll make sure I keep my hands where the camera can see them. So it has a half cock notch, or does it? No, I'm sorry, that's the half cock notch. That back here, that's just the double action mechanism. So this is the actual sear engagement surface, is this cut here. This one's been filed down for some reason. I don't know, wasn't ninth hand gun for me. So the sear hangs onto the hammer right there, and so when something pulls the sear forward, that lets the hammer come down. So that's that engagement there. Sear gets pulled back, hammer can come forward. This other back part is for the double action. So when the gun's not cocked, the trigger bar will be sitting all the way back here. And if you recall, we noted before that the hammer pin stuck further out one side because the trigger bar sat right under it. So what you're going to see is as I'm pulling the trigger bar forward, it's going to cock the hammer back, but I'm also getting pushed down. And at some point, if my hands were steady enough, what you would see is that I get pushed all the way off the bottom of the hammer, and I'm no longer going to be holding on to that. So the problem of illustrating it is that I don't have perfectly steady hands, but the idea is that at some point in that hammer pull, I will clear that ledge. So right there, I'm underneath it, which means I'm not holding on to it. So I've pulled the hammer all the way back, and then suddenly I'm not holding on to it at all, and it can come forward. Timing wise, it's designed to happen at the same time as this same mechanism for the single action has moved the sear system and the firing pin safety off of the hammer. So basically the double action is going to hit that point and actually engage the single action first, just slightly before the double action lets go. That way when the double action lets go, it doesn't just drop onto the single action. The single action's already been cleared and it just fires. What else? For the disconnect, again, all we needed to do was push all this stuff down, and then the disconnector spring would take over everything else. And so that's accomplished with this leg that sticks way up, and essentially it lives normally in this groove where it can ride up into the slide, but when the gun fires, that groove is no longer there, which means it's going to get pushed down into the disconnected position. And now when it returns here, it'll have the ability to come back up, but you'll have to let your finger off the trigger to get it in the right position to do that. And we'll show that better when it's reassembled. Let me knock out those last two pieces here so you can see how those mechanisms work. Just in case you knocked yours out, it's sometimes helpful. So this pin does have one end which is tapered, and that's important because it makes it easier to get through the spring. And right now, that's the only thing holding it in there. And this is plastic, and I just dropped the spring straight out from under it. So let's put it all back together with carpet fuzz. And there's a couple things to note. First of all, if your spring did fall out and you look at it, it's got a long leg and it's got a shorter leg with different bends in the short leg. There's a bend close to the coil. The long leg, the bend is much further away. The long one is the one that engages with the hammer. The short one is actually just the underside of the plastic piece has a groove right here that leg is going to sit in. So when we take this spring and we drop it inside here, that little short leg is going to sit in this groove, and the spring will go through the whole thing and hold it together. So that's what holds everything in place. The reason it's got a groove is so that it can lay flat against the frame of the gun. And then this piece here is what is engaging that back part of the hammer, so that if the hammer wants to go all the way forward, it's got something pulling it back down. The reason that the pin has a taper is because that makes it easier to get it all lined up and driven through. So the taper end is the one that you want to put in first. And so I'm going to leave it assembled for a second just so I don't lose the spring. And last but not least, here is the magazine release. Be careful. This is a piece that you can lose and send flying across the room very easily. You need something fairly thin and pokey to get at it, because what you can see here is half of a roll pin, or excuse me, half of a pin. And that's exactly what it is. The other half is actually engaging in a notch inside the frame, but you have to be able to disengage that pin, and it's under spring tension. So if I take something flat, I'll be able to push that pin in, and then the whole thing can pop up. But I don't want to lose that, or the whole thing will go flying. So that wasn't the best demonstration of how to safely do that, and I apologize, but what you want to do is stick a finger on the inside of the gun to hold on to the magazine release, hang on to the top as well, push it down just a little bit, push that piece in, and then guide it up and off, and then guide that piece out. So this piece has got a spring in a little cup, and the little cup is the half pin, so the pin with half a head. And so when that sticks out over the top, the shallower part is actually notched into the frame, and then the entire spring, or the entire magazine release, also has a spring in the backside that's the magazine release tension. So that's what actually pushes it back to the outside. That's the little ledge that the magazine catches on, and it is symmetrical because you can in fact put it in the other way. And if you say, well, how do you do that? There's this plate in the way. Well, this plate actually has a little nipple in there so that you can slide it off. And it's just a piece of sheet metal that's had the edges flattened down at an angle, and there's a very slight groove cut into the frame there. So this piece slides in and out, and the same cuts are on this side. So if I wanted to make this left-handed, I just take this piece to this side and again line it up so it's going to move relatively straight in, and slide it into place. And so now I have the exact same setup but on the other side of the gun. So I can put, whoops, I can put this one back together the exact same way, and now this pin is actually on this side. Pokey bit comes out at the top. Oops, and there we go, shot myself in the chest. Son of a gun. Every damn time. That's what happens when you don't pay attention to the spring. Ow. Well, there's the cup, but not the rest of the spring. EDT. Every time. Alright. Now we've recovered the spring. And I'm going to do that again, only we're not going to be an idiot this time. And we're going to put it in correctly, which is actually that pokey bit is the bottom, not the top, because when we poke it in, it latches under like that. Sorry, I said it backwards. Poked out bit is the part that latches into the frame, not the other way around. So again, taking it out, same idea, push that in, guide it out, hang on to it, pull it out, hang on to the spring. Since I'm not left-handed, I'm going to come over here, slide the plate off, put the plate back on the other side. Magazine catch back in. Now again, I will describe this correctly this time. The ledge is the bottom side because that's what actually gets caught under a lip in the frame. So when we go to push this in, we want that on the bottom so that it can pop into place correctly. I'm going to kind of just do this in reverse order. So I'm going to hang on to this piece with the short leg of the spring back here basically, and guide it back in to the frame in such a way that hopefully it doesn't flop around too badly. And then I'm going to gently get this guy started and make sure that that did not actually hit anything bad. Spring should be there, it shouldn't be bent or anything. Looks like it's pretty well lined up. So tap him back into place. And we can start putting bits back together. So we're going to slide the hammer in and hook it under that spring, and then put the hammer pin through once we know that we're hooked. So I want to make sure we're hooked. Don't push the hammer all the way forward or you will flip it past that spring. So if you do this, you can't just push the hammer back anymore. You're on the wrong side of that rear spring. You've got to pull the pin out and put the hammer in again and hook the spring again. So if you do get the hammer snap all the way forward and misses that spring, you got to pull it out of the gun again. So we don't care. We're going to let the hammer stay towards the back. We're going to put the ejector back in by hooking it over the Sear spring pin and then just rotating it back into place. Oops, fumble fingers. And then the Sear pin itself, we're going to slide partially into place just to hold things together for a minute while we talk about how to get all the guts back in there at once, because there is a little bit of a trickiness to this. So remember when we talked about how these two parts engage, the sear and the safety, excuse me, that the leg of the sear that sticks out to the side goes between the two legs of the firing pin safety. And the firing pin safety has this big ledge to the left. So if you try to put them in a unit, you have all kinds of problems because you can't get that leg of the safety in from the top at the same time. You really kind of have to come up from underneath. And if you put the sear in first, it's kind of hard to get the firing pin safety in just right. You can do it, but basically you just got to have a lot of luck on the angles to get over it and then down. So again, you got some choices here. If you're good and lucky, you can try and get them both in at once. I think I'm just going to do the sear first and then the safety after, and we'll see how lucky we get. And I'm going to come in from the bottom on the sear, because that leg, as I mentioned, it's hard to get it clear. I have seen somebody who actually had the magnet on a stick do this, and it looks like it made their life a lot easier. I don't actually have one of those here. I do have one at the shop, but basically I just want to get it started from the bottom there, and if the cat hair were out of the way, I can get that manipulated pretty far up until it's where it needs to be to catch the sear pin. Alright, and so now again here I want to position things, so I'm going to push the sear all the way to the left side of the gun. I'm going to push the pin in just a little bit more to give myself the maximum amount of room to get this guy in. Now I know that I have to get this leg underneath all of that, so when I come in here, kind of want to aim this, you can see from the side what I'm aiming at, to get it into that right position. And then a little light on the subject, I should be able to get the sear spring through that. So now the sear spring's through everybody and everybody's in their right place. Of course, we didn't put the sear spring in, but that's because it's easier to put that in now. And what I'm going to do is, since this is the hard two pieces to get in, and this piece pretty much is easy, the sear itself and the safety are the tricky parts. The ejector, well, kind of just sits still. So I'm going to come in from this side and I'm going to poke out that spring. It's still in the sear. I didn't poke it all the way out. I just poked enough room that I could stick Mr. Spring right back in there. So of course you have to basically poke it out till it's flush, and then slide the spring in there. Now the spring it's going to sit right in there, and whoops, with a minimum of wiggling, you should get everything to line up again and get that sear pin through. Let me shine a little light on it so I can see in the hole. Which part am I missing? And I think the ejector is a little far forward. There we go. So now sear pin is going to be just a little past flush on both sides, and that's everything in the right spot. Now we just got to put that under tension. Sig actually sells a screwdriver that has 4 different tools built into it, and it's really handy. One of the tools is a screwdriver with a notch right in the middle, and its whole purpose in life is so that that notch can grab this leg of the sear and easily manipulate it. Since I don't have one, I'm going to do it with a flat screwdriver. It's going to want to slip off my screwdriver, and so we got to kind of hold it stiff angle wise. If this screwdriver had a notch in it, that would have been even easier. But all you got to do is push it down and then just get it to flip over the underside of that sear spring pin. So now we've got sear pressure, and so the sear is now in the way, holding it back. And when we were talking about the hammer drop mechanism, and its wonky spring, what's going on there is just this whole mechanism reaches way in there and gets right underneath. Let's see if we're going to get any angle where we can see this. Right underneath the edge of the sear. So if you look at it from this side, hoping you can see in the hole that as this comes in from the side, it just barely meets in to the edge of the sear, or the underside of the sear. So now you can see that come just right there. So it's basically on the underside of the sear. When it's going to rotate forward, it pushes the sear forward, which means takes the sear out of engagement with the hammer. Well, without the pin in there, it's going to be hard to do that. So too hard to illustrate without all the parts in there. The point is it moves the sear forward so the hammer can get out of the way. Let's see, what did we put in next? Our trigger bar and trigger, if I'm not mistaken. And we're just going to do the opposite of what we did to get them out, which was we kind of came in at an angle and at just the right position, we get that to the point where it can snap under again and flop right in. So as we were taking it out, we canted it towards the inside, and now as we put it in, we just get it under that ledge and cant it back. And that's where it's going to sit. And then there's two pieces that pin has to go through. So the takedown lever is one, and then the trigger itself is the other. And we're back to our pin where we talked about it's got the horizontal indicator, but we got to remember that the grooves are towards the front and on the underside of the pin. So when we slip this pin through, we're going to make sure that we go through the firing pin, through the trigger, and take one last look to make sure our grooves are on the underside and on the front, and come through here. And we know that this wants to be essentially perfectly horizontal and flush to be in the right position for this next step. And the next step is in fact putting the locking block and spring in. So that spring sits in its little hole, and we're just going to hold them together. But the trick is when we bring this in, a couple things have to be positioned correctly. We want to be holding the trigger forward. We want to make sure that this is horizontal and not rotating. The slide lock needs to be pushed all the way over to the side of the frame because it can wiggle its way in. And if it wiggles its way in, what you see how it came away from the side of the frame here? It needs to be butted up against the side for this all to go in properly. And as we slide this piece in, what it's going to do is, if I could aim a little bit better, what it would do is we would find that it drops right in and went right along that pin and the grooves. Because we're holding everything correctly positioned, it's very easy to get that to slide along those grooves in and out of the gun. But if anything is not positioned correctly, it becomes much more of a challenge. So again, trigger forward, make sure this is horizontal and flush, make sure that we paid attention to our pins, the grooves in the pin so they're on the underside, and make sure that the slide lock is all the way to the side of the gun. With all those things done, you're just going to aim for those slots to line up on that pin when you put it in there, and it just drops right in. So if you do any of that wrong, it becomes difficult, but don't do it wrong. And to get it to hold itself in place, we're just going to work the locking mechanism back in. That's going to put tension on the spring. Right now the spring is floppy because nothing is pushing it down there. Now remember, as we go, we need to push that out of the way. And it gives you the right tools for this. As you guide this back in, the reason it's got that cut in the edge is so that you can start it. And now we're on the, that pin is lying in that groove. So when we rotate this, we just push that pin out of the way and we can push past it. We get it all the way to the other side of the frame, and we'll start into the lugs there, and the same situation. As we rotate it around, we will push past all of that. And then we get to the place where it's going to lock into that pin in the two positions and give us a nice firm 90-degree. And at the same time, we've got tension now on our slide release. Go ahead and throw this guy back on. Now remember which end is which, and the fact that it's going to want to follow the contours of the gun. So don't try and put this in the wrong way and get all confused. The one with just two 90-degree angles, and it's the smaller end. It hooks into the frame hole right behind the magazine back plate, magazine release back plate, and then it hooks under the bottom of the trigger bar. So I mean, it will have a little play, but not a lot. So don't be rough with it. But essentially, now we have a trigger return going on, as well as something pushing back against the disconnect strip. And now over here, this is one where on the 220, the single stack versions of this, unless you have really tiny fingers, this is much harder. But on the double stack, it's actually, there's a pretty much a very straightforward trick, which is stick this piece on your little finger. Now when it comes in here, this is how it's going to sit. The notch in the back plate matches the window where you can see all the good stuff happening. So if you're trying to put it in like this, you're wrong. You're blocking the window. That's why that notch is there, so you can still see in. So I like to just stick it on my pinky, stick it on the inside, and just guide it. Whoops, I said that, and now I'm failing. So in theory, we should just be able to guide that right up into place without too much fuss. It does sometimes create a little fuss. There we go. So holding it in there with my finger, it pops right through the frame. This piece just lays over the top of it, and everything's going to flop around until we get our spring tension in. So remember, the zigzag piece lays across there, and it's going to self-tension and self-lock everything into place once we put a little bit, whoops, once we miss completely. So let's try that again. Lay that down in the groove. And there we go. Now we've locked it in, so theoretically we can hold the whole gun up by that. And all we want to do is bring this piece back and let it go into the hole. Now the spring is not only providing the tension here, but it's holding the outside piece to the inside piece and holding it all together. And so we should be able to see that hammer drop in action now. We push the sear out of the way, and we're hitting the hammer at the same time. The double action should pull the hammer back, and if we provide the tension to go forward, we'll see all that stuff happening at the same time. We start to pull it back, and you will see the short leg on the top of the trigger bar engage the firing pin safety and lift it up. So as we're pulling, now it's basically engaging the single action mechanism. So it deactivates the safety, it removes the back leg has picked up the sear, so it's now the whole single action mechanism is out of the way, and the hammer can fall all the way. And then the reset stroke, let's see, I had already pulled, so we've pulled the trigger. The reset is going to let that happen. It's going to let the sear bring everything back and reset it so it catches the hammer, and then you'll actually, as you let off the trigger, that's your reset point where you can pull again. Now they do have a short reset trigger if you don't like the reset on them. It's already pretty good to me, but there's people who really don't like it, and we'll get into that once we put a little tension on it with our mainspring. So the mainspring, again, it needs to get into that groove in the back of the, or between the two halves of the back of the hammer. And from an orientation standpoint, this part is going to rest on that back pin that the little spring is also holding on to. So the little spring holds on to the top of the pin. This piece will be on the bottom of it. That's actually the transfer point for the energy. This big curve will actually bottom out against the pin itself, and that's what stops it from pushing the hammer any further forward. Is it runs into the to the hammer pin itself. So the actual force is pushed on that back pin of the hammer. So when this comes up, it pushes the back, which pushes the hammer around clockwise. But then this bottoms out in a position where the hammer has a little bit of flop, and then this spring pulls it to the back of the flop section. The point is that this tail bit is the back, not the front. So you should just be able to hook this around and see through the window it go right up on the inside of the hammer, and make sure it goes all the way to the back. And once it does that, again, you guide it up, guide its shoulders right up to the edge, and then take your trusty screwdriver to pop it right over the edge on the frame. And now we have actual hammer tension, we have fire, we have disconnect, we have cock again. You can see the reset. In order for this to reset, it just has to get behind the firing pin safety. So the reset is to there. And then when I pull, bang. The short reset trigger system is actually pretty weird. It replaces the sear with a sear that's got a big ledge. And so the trigger actually engages the sear directly. And then the firing pin safety, instead of having two legs, it has one really long rear leg, which is actually operated by the back of the trigger bar. So it just kind of times everything a little differently. But frankly, this, I don't know. I'm not sure what the big deal is. To me, this it's got a lot of motion here if you've come completely off the trigger. But usually when I'm firing, I'm worried about the reset between shots, which is super short. So the reset between entire single action pulls, not so much. I like two-stage triggers. So if I had it cocked and locked in my holster and I drew, I like triggers that have a light first stage and a very distinct second stage. So I like a little take up and then a crisp break. And what I care about for reset is just between shots. And again, you can see ain't a whole lot. That's not a ton of reset. So again, I like them. So that's how they work, why they work, all that good stuff. Sig has done a couple different versions of how these attach, and the screws are very specific to the exact model number. Because this is a wider one, it actually has shorter screws, and they've put these built in to the frame raised thread holes, and you don't want to strip them. You know, you never want to strip anything, but stripping an aluminum frame is kind of the worst. So they put a little bit of red Loctite, not the super permanent red Loctite. I guess it's technically the pink Loctite. But again, the point is, don't over tighten these guys. You know, snug them up, and they're not going to go anywhere. And leave that red on them that came there from the factory, and you'll never have problems. Some of the older ones, like I think my 220 actually has lock washers, so don't lose those if you have a version with lock washers. And again, Sig sells replacements for all that good stuff. So full reassembly. Now that we're back at the field strip position, barrel, mainspring. I always try and line that up as best as possible. This one does not have a curved groove. It's just a flat that this curved recoil ride sits on. I don't like that so much. It's nicer when it actually sits in a groove and self-centers. So the only point is, you know, pay attention to that so you don't create a challenge for yourself. Obviously, put it on facing the right direction, save you lots of time and effort. And again, to put it back on, put it all the way into the lock position, flip that up. So that's our full safety and function check in rapid style, that everything works. So the slow version of that is double action pull should work. It does. So double action, pull and hold, rack, and it should stay back for a single action. Reset, fire, rack, reset, fire. That all works. Now the decocker, again, we should feel it take the sear off, and at which point then we'll suddenly have all of the hammer tension on our thumb, and our thumb guides the hammer down. It works better in slow motion. So as I slowly let my thumb up, wow, I can't do it slow because that's a lot of pressure. There we go. So again, I catch the hammer and slowly let the hammer down. And as we said before, that little spring, the hammer's got extra room to go forward, and that spring always tugs it back to the back. So the hammer never just sits there resting on the firing pin. And actually, technically, because we used the hammer drop, it's in the half cock notch. If we actually had fired it and something got it forward, that spring is going to actually pull it all the way back till the sear gets in the half cock notch as well. So it's really all about getting the hammer into a position where even if you did drop it, it's not going to drop in any way that can ever transfer pressure all the way to the firing pin. So that's the Sig 220, 228, 229, 226 series. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope I didn't have too much of it off center frame at the beginning. And that's it. Stay safe. Have fun. Thanks.